Now, starting from September 1st, South Africans can access their retirement savings through the two-part retirement system that follows President Cyril Ramaphosa's signing of the Pension Fund Amendment Bill. The system allows workers to access a small portion of their retirement savings before retirement for emergencies, promoting preservation and aiding those struggling to make ends meet. Now, members can withdraw up to 10%, or 30,000 rand from their retirement fund. We will be expanding on this, speaking to independent analyst Khaya Sithole for more. Khaya, very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. We're essentially a couple of weeks away from the two-part retirement system being implemented. Lots of South Africans are hoping to access funds come September 1st, but there's a lot to consider, isn't there?
Good evening, and good evening to the viewers. There's definitely a lot to consider, and obviously the most obvious key consideration is whether an individual should indeed exercise the option and access a part of their savings. And obviously the rationale behind the system was to deal with a couple of issues. And the biggest issue was the fact that in the absence of this flexible regime, there was evidence of a lot of individuals essentially retiring prematurely just in order to be able to access the savings. And obviously what that did is that it eroded their long-term savings. And that means by the time they got to retirement age, they quite simply did not have enough. So the key question that was really being canvassed is whether we could have a more flexible system that allows people to really access some of the savings during emergency periods. And of course, the definition of an emergency will vary from each individual, but also to be able to do so without really eroding the base of their savings that they've accumulated over many years. So now we have to wait and see how it actually gets taken up by various individuals when it becomes effective in a couple of weeks.
There's been a lot of warnings from those in the financial space and about people having to think carefully about the withdrawal, more so if one has to consider the tax implications. What's at stake?
So unfortunately, the tax implications are a key component of this, in that until one reaches normal retirement age, in which case there has been a different tax regime associated with normal retirement. What the tax model does is that if you retire prematurely, or rather if you access your funds prematurely, then the taxes to be paid are relatively higher. So it simply means that even though one might say that you can access 30,000, whatever the amount is, one then has to work out how much they will actually have as after-tax cash flow, because if it turns out that the emergency that you're trying to cover is an emergency that requires 30,000 rand, the reality is that you actually won't have 30,000 rand in your bank account after the withdrawal because of the taxes that need to be paid. So the key issue here is for individuals to firstly understand what their own tax profile is, which will obviously determine what the taxes that will be due on whatever withdrawal that they make, and then figure out whether it still is indeed the right course of action to access this amount in light of what the emergency might actually need. Because if it turns out that you access it and you still can't cover that emergency in full, you still have to find an alternative way of essentially dealing with that emergency situation.
What about in the case where one may have outstanding penalties or taxes with the South African Revenue Service? What will happen when that money is about to be released or is set to be released?
So the reality here is that obviously one's tax profile with SARS is something that one must always be alert to and figure out whether they've got any particular outstanding taxes or penalties. And in instances where there is indeed a pre-existing tax obligations, there are instances where SARS can say, look, you can be in a position to put together a payment plan, for example. So the key question is that you must always engage with the revenue authorities and explain your case, and then come up with an arrangement that does not end up with surprises. And of course, if you do not plan that, there is a strong possibility that you may wake up one day with either a final letter of demand or maybe amounts being taken without your awareness. And that's really something that a lot of people need to be fully alert to regarding their own tax affairs. And obviously, in instances where there is a risk that your money is essentially taken up by pre-existing obligations, again, maybe the best intentions behind this may not be realized in relation to those particularly unique circumstances. But every single person has got a different tax issue that they have to be able to be aware of before they do the withdrawal.
As you started talking about the two-part retirement system, in theory, it sounds great. You need money, you've got an emergency, you'd like to withdraw the funds for something really important. But when it boils down to what's on paper, what considerations do you think one needs to make before deciding if it really is worthwhile to access the funds at this stage?
Well, I think the main consideration is a simple question of whether it is possible to find an alternative source of funds rather than tapping into your long-term retirement savings. And the reason that matters is that obviously we do know the magic of compounding is simply that if you keep your money there for longer and you do not withdraw, then the net benefit in the long run is much higher. So when there is a withdrawal, the ability to essentially capitalize on that compounding effect is seriously undermined. And of course, what one has to be able to also establish is how far they are from their own normal retirement, because the shorter the time frame, then the less likely it is that that person could really restore that savings base to the type of levels that would be commensurate with their requirements at the age of retirement. I think people who've got a much longer period between now and retirement age can essentially work on the basis that there's probably still enough of an opportunity for them to start topping up those savings that would have been eroded by these particular withdrawals. And it's also quite important for us to remember that there is an annual ceiling on how much you can tap into every tax year, so that you do not have an individual essentially eroding all their savings before they reach retirement age. So it is the government saying that, look, in the long run, we do need you to have something left for retirement, so therefore we're going to regulate how much you can access in the interim.
And just veering off slightly, Khaya, another story that was really quite a big deal today is Absa now essentially in search of its 7th CEO in less than 7 years. The talk is around the leadership woes. What are your thoughts around the story and the impact of Absa as a bank?
Look, it is very difficult for Absa because clearly it is undesirable that it keeps having so many executive shuffles, and it is reflective of a multiplicity of issues. And obviously the key issue is whether they do take enough time when they are embarking on a search for any CEO to really understand what it is, the type of organization that it has to be run, whether they've got the right fit in relation to the board that has to be conducting the process, and also the individuals that they ultimately choose. And the key problem here is that obviously until the bank takes the moment to reflect about what exactly it is that they're looking for in an individual and what type of support that individual would require, then the process runs the risk of actually being as problematic as it's been. So as it goes forward, Absa really needs to take a moment of reflection and ask itself very difficult question about why it keeps going wrong so frequently. And I think obviously once they have had that particular reflection, then we hope that when they start embarking on a search, they have a very clear explanation of who they're looking for, what it is that they can give to this person as support, and what they'd expect that person to deliver, so that whoever signs up for the job is not going to then claim to be unaware of the complexity of the job later on, because that would simply mean that the relationship will not work. So that's a difficult conversation that Absa unfortunately cannot defer anymore.
Yeah. As you speak about the complexities and the right fit that will need to be considered, we know that this early retirement comes after weeks of speculation. And what really stood out is that it's said that he didn't enjoy the support of his executive team. I mean, that in itself is a mouthful in terms of the importance of the right fit and the role, and one being allowed and given the authority to perform their duties with confidence.
Yeah, and I think obviously getting the right team around you that not only buys into the strategy that the organization has championed, but also believes in your ability to lead them, particularly through times of crisis, is an important one. And we do know that some CEOs prefer to essentially put together a brand new executive team based on the fact that they want to work with individuals of a particular persuasion and individuals of particular convictions. Now, obviously, that can be disruptive in instances where there are so many CEO shuffles. So you can imagine that if every single CEO of Absa who's emerged since Maria Ramos' time was given carte blanche to reassemble the entire executive team, there'd be much greater chaos out there. So it's important to be able to work out what are the existing strengths within the executive team that you inherit, and then work out what it is that you need to do in order to bolster and increase the capacity of the team, and then make sure that you do not preside over a mass exodus of executives, because that would mean that Absa is not just looking for CEO, but they're looking for an entire executive team.
And very quickly, before we let you go, do you think we could begin to see the impact filtering down to the customer?
No, I think it's probably a difficult one to assess at this stage, because what tends to happen is that these banks tend to have a very strong baseline customer base, people who've been there for many years. And what these banks try to play in is to tap into the pulse of new customers, new products, and new innovations in the market. That's what seems to distinguish them. So obviously what Absa needs to be able to figure out is whether the perception of new market participants, people who are looking for new products, if their perception is that Absa is the place to go to in order to get this type of service that I'm looking for. Because if not, it means that they're probably stuck with, the baseline customer base that they have, and that obviously isn't what anyone wants to see. Everybody wants to be able to grow. Everybody wants to be able to tap into bigger markets, and everyone wants to be able to offer better services to their clientele. And that's something that every bank needs to really figure out a way of doing. And it doesn't help when there's so many shuffles out there, because obviously a lot of it is linked to the strategic direction of the company itself. So you want to be able to see that particular link. And in the case of Absa, it will obviously become quite difficult when there's so many shuffles at the top.
Very well. Thank you so much for weighing in on this discussion, leaving it there with independent analyst Khaya Sithole speaking about the two-part retirement system and, of course, some analysis and reaction to Absa now looking for its 7th CEO.